Welcome to AI, Government and the Future, a podcast by Corner Alliance. We explore the intersection of artificial intelligence, government and the future. We work with government to create results. We ignite your agency's mission by helping you to design and implement high-impact and innovative federal programs in AI, broadband, cybersecurity, public safety, and more. Being a government ally is at the core of all we do.
Welcome back to AI, Government in the Future. I'm your host, Mark Lay, and today I'm thrilled to welcome Christabel Randolph to the show. Christabel is a leading voice in AI governance and tech policy, currently serving as Associate Director at the Center for AI and Digital Policy. She has played a pivotal role in shaping the regulatory landscape for artificial intelligence, particularly focusing on balancing innovation with the protection of fundamental human rights. With over a decade of experience as a licensed attorney in the law and technology field, Christabel has been deeply involved in regulatory efforts such as the European Union's AI Act and the U.S. Executive Order on AI. Today, we'll explore the critical issues surrounding algorithmic transparency and accountability systems, delving into how governments and organizations can ensure that AI technologies are used ethically and responsibly without necessarily constraining innovation or competitive advantage, in the private sector. So we're excited to have you on the show, Christabel, and welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. Happy to be here.
So as we begin today's discussion, we typically ask our guests, to share what really initially drew them to their fields of interest. So Christabel, do you mind sharing kind of the motivation or initial interest that you had in pursuing the intersection of artificial intelligence, human rights, and policy development?
Yeah, for sure. I'm a first generation female professional, right? And I've worked in a variety of roles across Southeast Asia and the Middle East with multinational corporations, with international organizations, in private practice as a lawyer, and also consulting with governments, right? So this allowed me to really get a vantage view dealing with a lot of different clients and on the long-term transformational impact of technology, right? From e-commerce to financial inclusion, or even when dealing with issues like tech facilitated gender-based violence. And I really felt that these institutions and legal frameworks tend to be reactionary. I wanted to leverage my skills and work more in policy where you have a more proactive role for shaping how frameworks and institutions respond to the technology that is evolving at such a rapid pace, right? And I think during COVID, really, when I was working in-house and, we saw AI tools being deployed for risk management, for employee, for contact tracing and everything. And that really made me pivot more mainstream into the AI and tech policy space. And yeah, I was a public interest fellow at Georgetown Law. And then I started with the Center for AI and Digital Policy. And that's, just taking the journey forward.
Very nice. No, I think a common theme that we explore on this show is, there's a lot of convergence of, communications and computing systems supporting industries that aren't traditionally, interacting with those technologies or haven't been. So I think a lot of these governance frameworks and policies guiding kind of the responsible and innovative rollout of new technologies are going to be, impacting a wider array of industries as we move forward. So that's great. I think it's a smart pivot, and happy to hear kind of that background. I guess, can you describe kind of your current scope of work? Where are you working now? And kind of what are the priority topics or projects that you're interested in?
Yeah, so the Center for AI and Digital Policy, we're an independent nonprofit research and education organization. Our work straddles in between being a think tank and a civil society. Our USP is that we're independent. We don't have corporate partnerships. We don't have government partnerships, but we have advised a lot of governments, a lot of international organizations. We're currently advisors to the OECD, to UNESCO, to UN, to the G7. We work with the European Parliament, as you mentioned, on the EU AI Act. We've worked very closely with the Council of Europe drafting committee for the first global treaty on AI. And I think a lot of people are still thinking that there's no regulation, there are no laws on the books, but here we are. We have a global AI treaty, and the US, UK, EU, 36 countries have already signed on. And right now, the main focus is our global campaign to get more countries and more governments to sign on to the Council of Europe AI treaty. My work, my day job, is broadly interacting with the US systems, with congressional offices, congressional committees, with state legislatures, with the federal agencies, really making sure that the public interest and the public voice is tabled in all these critical spaces where AI policy and where decision making happens, so that there is an independent public interest voice, shaping tech policy as it happens in the US.
That's great background. And I think we'll dig into in a few minutes maybe some key differences that you've noticed between working with maybe, European or offshore policymakers versus kind of the priorities or requirements that we're dealing with here in the US. I guess, as an associate director at the AI Center or the Center for AI and Digital Policy, I know you've been involved in some, significant work crafting recent, policies or best practices, governing or regulating kind of the rollout of AI. Are there any, key projects, accomplishments that you're particularly proud of that you'd like to speak to kind of before we dive in, given your recent work?
Yeah, sure. So one thing which is our flagship publication and which is a continuing thing is called the Artificial Intelligence and Democratic Values Report, where we actually do a global landscaping of AI policy and regulation. And so we really do bring out what are the best practices. And we score governments and we score countries on the basis of how rights respecting their AI frameworks are. So it's called the Artificial Intelligence and Democratic Values Index. It's on our website. What we've also done is we've commented on a number of really important, significant actions in the US, whether it's the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, whether it's, working in the California legislature and moving forward the Trading Data Transparency Act that passed just 2 months ago. And also we filed the first complaint with the Federal Trade Commission on ChatGPT and OpenAI, and which we believe was important to really bring change in business practices and establish guardrails for these AI systems that are being rapidly deployed in the market.
We'll dive into maybe some key considerations that should be accounted for from your perspective prior to, immediate adoption or rollout or scaled use of some of these foundational AI models. But I know transparency, you just mentioned the Transparency of Training Data Act that is recent. Transparency in AI means different things to different stakeholders or different, people who are involved at different, elements of the AI chain. In your experience, what does meaningful transparency look like? Is it just related to the data being used for these models, or is it apply to the model themselves? I guess anything that you can share on that front.
So the thing is that before we go into what transparency means, AI also means different things to different people. When ChatGPT rolled out, I think a whole generation of people, ChatGPT means AI for them, right? But then AI has been used in a lot of different things for many, many years now. And regardless of whether you're someone who's talking about generative AI or like a Gen AI native or someone who's been working with these rules-based expert systems for a long, long time, transparency has three very core basic pillars that cuts across all of these kinds of AI systems. It's the data that the systems are trained on, the logic of the system. So how exactly does your system work? And the output of the system. So it's just these three things. Are you being transparent on what kind of data you're using, where you've sourced this data from, how representative this data is, how robust the data is, how is your algorithm really working, what are the criteria, what are the proxies that you've put in, and how durable are your outputs? So is your system going to produce different outputs at different times? Because that's an important part of relying on a system. So it's just these three core things that comprise transparency.
I think that's very well said, and it kind of applies to kind of my basic understanding of any analytical system, whether it's artificial intelligence or machine learning or a predictive tool that a business uses to evaluate investments. And I guess, Christabel, from your perspective, are there key criteria, like evaluation criteria or metrics by which organizations can evaluate kind of the quality of their transparency or defensibility of the data that they're using, the processing logic that their models are using, or the reliability or durability of analytical outputs?
So at the very fundamental level, it's something basic. It's your system should do what you're saying it will do. So if I'm saying that my system is going to, diagnose something accurately, I should be able to show over a repeated period of series and instances it is doing that accurately, right? So it's very simple. It's like your system should do what you're saying or what you're marketing that it should do. Um, and transparency is not something new. When we talk about AI transparency, the one myth that I would like to bust is that this is a new concept. It's not. It's been around. The U.S. Privacy Act, which is one of like the oldest laws currently, like that had the transparency principle. So does the European data protection law. And it's been agreed by technologists and policy experts for many, many years. And how do you know whether a system is transparent? It's very simple. Before you market it, before you deploy it, you should do the testing. And when you're developing a product, you should do your own internal testing, and then you should also get an independent testing done. It's very common. We see that in all kinds of products, right? There are so many products that are released in the market where you have to do your own verification of how the system is working, but you also need to get an independent assessment or an independent audit or a certification or evaluation, whatever it is that confirms that, yes, this works as it's supposed to, or as you're saying it should. And then the other thing about the AI systems is like, you need to record what are the incidents. It's fine. We understand that nothing's perfect and there can be incidents that creep up, but you shouldn't suppress that. You should disclose that, right? So if there's a kink in the system, you should disclose that and you should record serious incidents. And you should continuously do that. So these are things which are not just a one-off thing. This is a continuous process. We see that in drugs. We see that in automobiles. We even see that for our devices, our computers, our laptops. All of these things have to go through some kind of testing, evaluation, certification process before they're rolled out. And AI should not be an exception.
I mean, automotive safety testing, the airbag will deploy at a collision at X miles an hour, 99.99% of the time. Now, I mean, I think that's a really good logic model to apply to this. Test and understand kind of the intention behind the data that you're using to inform AI models, how your models are processing that information, and the reliability of outputs. I think on the counter, people may say, hey, a lot of these AI systems, that are used by private or even increasingly public sector organizations are proprietary. Whether it's Microsoft Copilot or, ChatGPT, there isn't a ton of visibility, Gemini within the Google workspace, potentially. There's not a lot of transparency into the actual like engine of the LLM or, productivity tool itself. So for a general user or even a CTO or a, security officer for an organization trying to leverage some of these emerging tools, it can be difficult to understand how they fully, work. I guess from your perspective, are there ways in which, users can evaluate the transparency or fit of the AI tools that they're using for kind of business objectives before when they're maybe shopping around or before they commit to one tool over another?
That's a great question. And I'm really happy you asked that because at the end of the day, it shouldn't be on me as a buyer to evaluate the tool. I mean, of course, you go to the market, you're picking out something, you're choosing something that you think you like. But when we talk about guardrails, we actually mean that there should be a set of regulations or a regulatory framework in which the companies do this themselves, right? Because like you said, an individual user and an individual buyer is really not in that position to understand that level of technical nuance and detail. And maybe large corporations can, maybe even smaller businesses cannot do, like maybe a mom and pop store that's trying to upgrade into something digital might not really understand it. And that is why the onus is on the really larger developers, the larger deployers, and especially where the government is deploying it. It's not good enough to say that it's proprietary information, because if I am using a technology to determine whether someone's getting a pretrial release, what kind of sentence to impose on someone, these are like really serious life decisions. And this is something that you cannot just leave to the hands of the developers or the tech companies and say that it's proprietary. The public interest takes it takes precedence over these proprietary concerns. And for the government, it's really important because there are due process considerations. What if the government, all the DNA evidence, and you're using a system to interpret DNA evidence? You would have to understand how that system works, because how are you going to use it to develop a drug or to do a diagnosis or, for clinical processes if you don't understand? So even like in the healthcare, when pharmaceuticals, just think about the COVID time. And when you're working on like a vaccine for something really critical, you would need to understand how that system works before you rely it and like release a product or a medical device to like millions of people.
Are there methods by which, or best practices that, AI tool vendors, whether, the largest businesses in the world, or, maybe companies that are using, foundational models or other analytic outputs to develop their own suite of products and services, that they can kind of guarantee a certain like adequate level of quality or transparency without infringing on intellectual property rights? I know, for like FDA, or like organic is like a label that's been used in like the food industry, or with a lot of, hardware, there's a certain amount of this, laptop can, operates by certain communication protocols to make it equipped to handle like Wi-Fi calling, or can use this power adapter. Are there standards or certifications that people can maybe comply with or prove, without sacrificing maybe competitive differentiation or things of that nature?
The whole proprietary information, or the patent and the IP issue is, it's an argument that's on thin grounds, because you get a lot of devices marketed as environmental friendly, sustainable, low power consumption, and you're having to disclose how exactly it's working to get that certification. Now, I'm not advocating for a licensing regime, because then that creates entry barriers in markets, and we want more people to have access to this technology. We want more innovation, but there needs to be a regulatory framework. There needs to be a legal framework which requires an independent assessment, whether it's audit, whether it's impact assessments, call it whatever you want to call it, right? But there has to be an independent testing, because and it's not just, to sort of catch the bad actors or catch who's trying to, what is AI hype and what is reality. It's also helps the companies. Maybe there's something that they missed in the product development and testing phase, and an independent evaluation or audit or a pre-deployment assessment picks that up, and they're actually able to develop a better product and provide a better product to people, maybe even a product that could demand a premium, right? So it's not about closing the market, and it's not about creating barriers and restrictions, but it's creating a safety net through regulations where you have better innovations and, just access to safer technology.
Testing the durability of a commercialized product. I mean, that's something that private sector companies do before rolling out a new prototype, or this is all common within the emerging technology field, understanding that the technology that you're developing is behaving as it's intended and can be kind of adopted at scale. Are there certain, because you've made or you've cited some examples within maybe a legal use case or a biomedical like vaccine development use case, do the testing methods to kind of verify the quality, reliability, and safety of AI supported technologies, the testing methods and the evaluation criteria, do they need to be aligned with, the tool's intended use or like domain of use, or can they be kind of conducted agnostic of end use and like within the technology in and of itself?
Instead of having technology specific to a tool, you have to see regulation specific to the use case, right? So there are some systems that should not be used if they're pseudoscientific systems. So, for example, biometric categorization or social scoring systems, it doesn't matter if it's accurate. It just should not be used because those are systems that really violate the human dignity and human rights. So if it's a biometric categorization system, if it is a system for lethal autonomous weapons, which is like really a big concern and being discussed, and if it's a system which is, uh, going to cause predictive policing or social scoring, these are just systems which governments should not use. Private sector, of course, if you move from the public facing or government and public service to the private sector, of course, can decide at the back end what they want to use, but they have to require scientific validity of these AI systems, right? And they have to ensure that, that they're not producing discriminatory, biased, skewed outcomes. And algorithmic transparency doesn't mean that you assume that a system is discriminatory, or you don't assume that the system is discriminating against this person or that person. But the whole purpose of transparency is to understand, how is the system working? Is there a propensity for bias? Is there a propensity for discrimination? Is there a propensity or a vulnerability for a cybersecurity issue? And that, or a manipulation, how will the algorithm evolve? Does it go to a stage where you are not able to understand why it's producing the outcomes it's producing? And that exactly is what transparency is about. It's not necessarily assuming a bad intention, but it is simply, it should be tool agnostic. It should be tool agnostic, and it should be based on the use cases and the outcomes and why exactly am I using an AI system.
And I think as we talk a little bit more about, AI supported applications that may, violate or be in direct conflict with kind of, human rights, are there specific policy mechanisms or requirements that, you found to be effective in developing regulatory frameworks to guard against those kind of at-risk applications such as social scoring or mass surveillance that you would recommend be included in future regulatory frameworks, either here in the US or, across the globe?
In the European Union, the EU AI Act already has a category called prohibited AI systems, which means you cannot use them, right? It's not about whether they're bad, good, transparent, not transparent. It's about, you just cannot use them. So for example, social scoring is banned, right? Biometric categorization is banned. And there are certain red lines. Sometime in the 80s, the US banned lawn darts. It was a game that kids used to play. And we've banned so many products. The FDA has recently banned some kind of plastic glove because of a resin on it. So it's, we should normalize the idea that you can prohibit AI systems, right? Just because it's AI doesn't mean it's impervious to prohibitions and red lines. So let's start from there. Let's look at the systems that we really shouldn't deploy because it's not good. It's not in our collective interest. And then we come to a risk categorization, right? And the risk-based approach is something which is agreed in the US. It's agreed in the EU. It's something that there's consensus on. And when you say a risk-based approach, you see whether an innocuous system, if deployed in certain critical contexts. So for example, if it's deployed in the context of credit determination, if it's deployed in the context of sentencing and judicial processes, whether it is increasing human rights risks and whether it is having human rights impacts, right? Civil rights impacts. Am I denying somebody housing? Am I denying somebody credit? Am I denying somebody release from jail by using an algorithmic system? And that's where you really then test it according to the use case, and you see the risk level, and then you put in the mitigation measures, and then you put in the evaluation and control measures to make sure that even if you're using an AI system in this high risk use case, it is not it is not performing badly, and it is not performing against the public interest.
Yeah, and I don't know in terms of, because it's not, yeah, conducting an effective audit, from a human rights removing bias from the application of an AI system. Is that something that needs to be done before these tools are rolled out, or in real time when a certain sentencing decision is being made? Like, do these auditing capabilities need to be kind of applied at the front end of when tools are being developed and kind of licensed to potential consumers, or maybe built into the analytical process themselves, so that auditing or reporting capability is built into decision making in real time? I guess any best practices on that?
So, absolutely pre-deployment, and auditing is something that is well established across, and rather than saying audit, which sometimes audit can be construed as only from a financial perspective and not really a technical perspective, but technical. So, from a technical perspective, we call them impact assessments to understand how rapidly, at what scale, at what frequency, you know, the certain outcomes transpire in a system. So let's call them impact assessments, but they should absolutely be done pre-deployment, and they should be continued throughout the life cycle, right? If you look at impact, whether it's environmental impact assessments, whether it's any kind of safety assessments, whether it's even financial assessments and audits, it's always done on an annual basis or a periodic basis, just to make sure that you're stress testing it at a reasonable frequency, right? And it's not a lot. Many times it seems like, oh my God, are you proposing an overkill simply because it's AI and simply because it's you? No, it's not. Like, these things are happening across industries and across sectors. It's really not overkill. It's established. Yes, the technology is new. There are a lot of newer things happening. And as you mentioned, that is why the evaluation, auditing, assessment capabilities will also evolve as the technology evolves, right? So if you ask me, do you know the best AI auditor? No, I can't give you that answer. And what, the assessment for a typical rules-based system will be vastly different from the assessment of a large language model or a generative AI system, right? So it has to be responsive also to the technical design that is being deployed.
Yeah, well, it almost sounds like developing almost a taxonomy of best practices or recommendations for evaluating, the safety or impact of AI system, like different classes of AI systems, maybe different categories of, end uses or applications would be a useful resource.
On that point, I just want to say, a lot of times, especially when we talk about bias, are we humans free of bias? No, it's not like a human judge or a human police officer or a human social worker is operating without bias. That is true. Humans have bias, but the capability of one person to produce a biased impact is limited. Whereas a system, it's been proven, there's tons of data and tons of literature to show that the moment there's a system, when ChatGPT spouts out something, you're not then going back and researching whether ChatGPT is right or wrong, right? You're assuming that's right and you're working on it. So there's a real over reliance on systems once these processes are automated. And then if there is a bias or if there is a flaw, it is being amplified at scale, right? So it's not about human versus machine. The idea is that the systems and the machines should not amplify the human flaws.
That's a good point. Well, I was going to ask you as a follow up, from your standpoint, what are some of the key regulatory or policy gaps as they pertain to AI systems today? And are there ways in which we can begin to craft or address some of those policy or regulatory gaps without sacrificing kind of the U.S. competitive edge in this emerging computing field?
The US doesn't have a comprehensive act like the EUA Act. And I'm not here saying that the US should, right? Because different countries have different approaches and different political cultures. But there's a lot of things that has happened in the US, and not just in the last 2 years. Actually, even in 2020, there was an executive order on AI. And 2019, there was also an executive order addressing technological systems. Privacy related laws have been around for a while. So there are bits and pieces of legislation. And the last year in Congress has been super active. We've seen a lot of bills, like by some counts, like 120 AI bills. And then there are the states that are doing AI legislation. So there's a lot that is happening in the US to both address the potential and the risks, and they're not divorced from each other. Great regulation does incentivize great innovation as well. So what is missing, of course, is that there really isn't any AI specific law on the books at least federally. But the laws that we do have, for example, consumer protection laws apply to AI as well. I mean, you don't need a separate AI consumer protection law. The existing consumer protection laws and unfair practices laws would apply to AI systems. But what is missing is some of the laws with teeth, and we hope that Congress and moving forward, the government would look into those issues. Not to, you're competitive if you're safe and if you're secure and you have the guardrails in place. You can't be competitive in a completely risky environment. So we hope that, that's what we've been saying, that having rights respecting and public interest facing laws will just enable better technologies.
Yeah, and I guess as we wait for some of those policies, as you mentioned, I mean, I saw a memorandum from the White House on AI safety released 3 weeks ago, and there are a lot of individual, federal agency working groups looking at some of the technical mechanisms by which public sector organizations can promote, safe, effective, trustworthy, reliable, adoption of AI-based tools. So I guess, Christabel, from your perspective, we have a lot of federal government or research and development program listeners kind of tuning into the show. Are there ways in which public sector programs can support more effective, safe, transparent uses of AI while some of these policies become, more mature here in the US?
No, absolutely. And I think the US in successive administrations actually has taken exactly that approach, so that the federal government is setting the tone for the rest of the ecosystem. And we've seen that, last year there was an extensive executive order. There was a memorandum from the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB memorandum, which really sets out minimum practices that federal agencies must ensure for rights impacting and safety impacting AI systems. And then in September, OMB issued a procurement guidance. So when federal agencies are acquiring AI, what do you look at? What are the kinds of guardrails you need to have in place? What are the kinds of contractual terms you need to? And those things actually become a template for organizations, for the rest of the stakeholders in this space, for those who are doing R&D programs, whether it's labs in the universities. And we have a lot of great bills. We have, the Create AI Act. We've had the WET AI Act, the Future of AI Innovation Act, the ARIA Act, a lot of different bills that bring together different elements, some creating a national AI research resource, some looking more about the accountability of, private sector and also public sector programs and those measures. And of course, the federal agencies have also been doing their part. We've seen the FTC has launched Operation AI Comply, After we filed the complaint last year with regard to OpenAI and ChatGPT, in July, the FTC opened an investigation into OpenAI, and maybe the investigation is progressing. Of course, once it's open, we really don't know what's going on. That's an internal process. But the fact of the matter is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice, the states at the state level, we're seeing a lot of activity on AI regulation and laws, which is really setting the tone for this space as it evolves.
Great. Well, and I actually did want to get back to thinking through kind of best practices or recommendations for organizations, public or private, to consider when, adopting AI-based tools or, developing workflows, decision-making processes that leverage insights generated by AI tools. Going back to the AI and democratic values report or index report that is published on your organization's website, I guess what are, rather not necessarily getting into the detailed results of that index, but what are some of the key factors, attributes, or parameters that need to be satisfied for an organization, I guess in this case, a country, to score well against this evaluation?
So what we look at is baseline safeguards. And when we say baseline safeguards, we look at maybe 8 to 10 basic principles. So, transparency, accountability, contestability, public safety, fairness, accuracy, and human determination and termination. So, for example, is there a requirement that if a system goes out of control, you have like a kill switch, right? So we look at these metrics, and these are actually very closely aligned with the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. So it's not a bespoke framework that we've invented. It's actually what is really globally accepted and known and established over the last, more than 50 years now, right? And we look at whether the country has a policy or laws on the books that have these baseline safeguards. We look at whether there is independent oversight of the industry. And we look at whether there is, very importantly, opportunities for public participation. And is the government listening to the people? And is the people's voice and concerns being reflected in the policies? And if I were to bucket, there are 12 metrics that we look at, but if I were to bucket it, it's 3: baseline safeguards, independent oversight, public participation.
That's great context. In terms of making recommendations for, maybe not a national organization, but even individual organizations that are trying to design, new business or organizational capabilities that leverage these tools, I think that those are useful kind of criteria or considerations to keep in mind, to ensure that these tools are being leveraged responsibly. So thanks for sharing that.
And for organizations, and there are organizations of different sizes. There are startups and newer, smaller and medium enterprises, in addition to the big tech that's wanting to enter the space and work in the space and innovate in the space. And it really is like, ask yourself the question is, what is my tool being used for? If it is being used for a process that is going to impact people's lives and livelihoods, then you really are going to be held to a much higher standard of diligence. But if you're doing a tool that's, crunching numbers somewhere, or just doing a data cleaning, or something that is not directly related to those critical decisions, and maybe you would not have to go to that level of due diligence. And that's why we see a lot of countries and a lot of governments coming up with regulatory sandboxes, to encourage. So you are developing your systems and your safeguards and your compliances at the same time. And everybody, the one thing that people don't realize about the EU AI Act and about a lot of laws happening in Singapore, Dubai, Saudi Arabia, a lot of the places in rest of the world, is also governments are not just saying that we want to regulate AI, but they're coming up with these sandboxes, which is to really enable newer players and more innovation at the same time, while seeing that, okay, what is the contextual safeguards that you need to maintain as you're innovating?
Yeah, well, I think, what we talked about earlier in the show, testing the, quality or transparency of the data being used to train some of these systems, the processing mechanisms or logic that these systems use to derive conclusions, and then the repeatability of results. I mean, that does testing and evaluating and refining systems based on those test results across those three categories of an AI-based system. It's going to it results in more effective kind of stress tested products that could be differentiated from competition as well. So I think there's a lot of benefits, as you're saying, around inviting a little bit of scrutiny, testing, and feedback on how these systems operate, in addition to kind of the ethical, human rights considerations that you're obviously focused on as well. Great. Well, I guess, as we close, are there any specific principles or strategies that we haven't covered that you would recommend, public sector organizations consider while, evaluating the relevance, effectiveness, or ethics of an AI-based tool?
I think our organization, our mission is AI and technology that works in the public interest and promotes social inclusion. And the only recommendation is the principles that we've talked about are really well established, both not just in the policy community, but more importantly in the technological community as well. AI is not new, it's been around for like 50 plus years. And these are consensus principles. And it's just about making sure we hope the US really has a lot of impact and influence, of course, for its own people and for the American people, but globally as well. And while the rest of the world looks to how the US is innovating, it also does look at how the US is regulating. And we hope that we see regulation that addresses transparency and accountability for these systems.
Great. Well, Christabel, thanks so much for taking time and speaking with me this afternoon. I guess where can listeners go to check out more of your work?
caidp.org.
Great. Well, Christabel Randolph, thank you so much, Associate Director at the Center for AI and Digital Policy. Appreciate your time and look forward to monitoring your and the center's work moving forward.
Thanks so much, Mark. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to y'all.
Absolutely.
AI, Government and the Future is brought to you by Corner Alliance. To find out more about Corner Alliance and how we work with government to create results, visit our website at corneralliance.com. And then make sure to search for AI Government Future in Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Corner Alliance, thanks for listening.